Welcome to Lecture 14. In this lecture, we will consider the norm of stare decisis, examining how the Supreme Court uses and interprets its own precedents in decision-making. In doing so, just as we've been doing over the past several classes, we'll think about what the various theories of judicial decision-making predict about the role of precedent, and we'll examine some empirical evidence to determine how the court employs precedent in its decisions. In doing so, we'll very carefully define what stare decisis means. We'll look at the historical use of stare decisis and think about some justifications for why stare decisis infiltrates all of the Supreme Court's opinions, and then we'll evaluate the empirical evidence to see whether stare decisis, whether precedent actually constrains, influences, or shapes judicial behavior. Well, we've defined this principle way back at the start of the semester and we've used it repeatedly. Let's remind ourselves of the basic definition of the principle of stare decisis. Stare decisis quite literally means let the decision stand. It is an informal rule that directs judges to follow legal rulings from prior cases that are factually similar to ones being decided. In other words, the norm of stare decisis informally requires judges and justices to follow precedent, treating like cases alike. Despite the fact that stare decisis is an informal rule or norm, it has become the defining feature of American courts and is perhaps the most critical piece of the American judicial infrastructure. However, whether stare decisis actually provides a meaningful constraint on judicial behavior, especially to that of Supreme Court justices, is a matter of debate. Some scholars, especially those who employ the legal model of judicial decision-making, contend that precedent is the law that binds. These scholars argue that justices adhere to legal precedent in their decisions as the law exercises a gravitational pull. In other words, past court decisions substantially constrain the options available to the justices, compelling certain actions in current cases. On the other hand, scholars who employ the attitudinal model argue that policy preferences and ideology alone drive judicial decision-making, and that precedent merely provides a cloak for the justices to use to mask their decisions, to make them look unbiased and legitimate. In this view, then, precedent and the norm of stare decisis do little to curb explicitly ideological behavior. Finally, the strategic model of judicial decision-making suggests that justices are driven by their policy preferences, but that the law can creep in and influence behavior. Before we get to the meat of the lecture, let's take a quick look back at a few quotations that we've already talked about earlier this semester to remind ourselves what the justices and federal judges themselves have to say about the constraining force of Supreme Court precedent. In Agostini versus Felton, the court acknowledges the informal role of stare decisis, noting that it is not an inexorable command, but it is a matter of judgment. In an opinion from a case in 1986 called Vasquez versus Hillary, the court wrote that the doctrine of stare decisis, quote, permits society to presume that bedrock principles are founded in the law rather than in the proclivities of individuals, and thereby contributes to the integrity of our constitutional system of government, both in appearance and in fact. Thus, by the Supreme Court's own admission, the use of precedent is a discretionary choice that serves to legitimize its opinions. Judge Frank Coffin of the First Circuit Court of Appeals confirms the ambiguity of precedent. He concedes that precedent governs, but it is never so clear that it dissuades parties from appealing, since litigants from both sides typically are able to muster some precedent that supports their position. Finally, Judge Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals provides a very different view of the role of precedent. Rather than view it as a constraint on judicial behavior, Posner suggests that judges and justices use precedents to cloak their policy preferences. This, according to Posner, is not a genuine constraint, but is rather a phony use of law to advance one's ideological policy agenda. There are clearly different views of how and when precedent is used in the American judicial system, but there is absolutely no question that stare decisis is firmly embedded in the legal process. But when and why did the doctrine of stare decisis develop as an institutional rule that governs judicial behavior? For an answer to that question, let's take a trip back in history to the founding of the Supreme Court in the late 1700s. Prior to the court's term beginning in 1800, the Supreme Court relied heavily on English common law as its legal authority. In fact, prior to 1800, more than 75% of legal citations included in opinions by the United States Supreme Court came from English common law. But by the early 19th century, the court began to increase its reliance on its own previous decisions, swiftly moving away from the authority of English common law. By 1815, only 10% of the court's legal citations stemmed from English law. It should be noted that the reliance on precedent, like so much else in the court's institutionalization, was a gradual or incremental process. In the first half of the 19th century, the court's majority opinions cited very few precedents, typically interpreting fewer than 5. By contrast, today the court's majority opinions usually include reference to about 25 precedent-setting cases. Additionally, in the early 19th century, the majority of cases didn't include legal citations at all, whereas today it is the rare case that doesn't include reference to previous court decisions. The precedent citation patterns clearly indicate that as the court developed in the 19th century, it built up a cache of precedents from which it could draw on to bolster its opinions. And in doing so, it thoroughly indoctrinated the principle of stare decisis into the American judicial system. Okay, so it's possible to see that the court has increasingly relied on precedent over time. But why did the court have an incentive to cultivate the principle of stare decisis in the first place? A few political scientists, whose names you're probably familiar with by this point in the semester, Tim Johnson, Jim Spriggs, and Paul Walbeck, argue that judges and Supreme Court justices use stare decisis to increase the authority and legitimacy of the judiciary. If you recall, the judicial system in the United States got off to a rough start. The judiciary was designed as the weakest political institution. Lacking the power of the purse and the sword, as we've noted in the past, the court is reliant on the elected branches of government for its decisions to be translated into effective governing legal policy. Thus, it is absolutely vital that the other branches of government and that the public at large view the court's decisions as legitimate, and that they see the court as the authoritative voice in the policy process. By moving away from English common law and by increasing reliance on its own past decisions, citing more and more Supreme Court precedent cases, the court continually asserted its own authority. Moreover, by establishing the doctrine of stare decisis, the justices found a way to legitimize their policy choices by providing neutral, legal justifications for their decisions. In short, stare decisis increased at least the perception of the court's legitimacy and insulated the Supreme Court from the elected branches of government, carving out a place for the court to be the final authority in constitutional law. Alright, so justices obviously have a strong incentive to use precedent to legitimize their policy choices as embodied by the court's majority opinion. But simply citing precedent-setting cases tells us nothing of influence. Note that the repeated theme of the semester is to understand what causes a justice to behave the way that she does. Well, we know that the court uses precedent in its opinion. Does the doctrine of stare decisis actually influence the decision a justice makes, or is it simply a post hoc justification of a predetermined decision? This is actually a much harder research question to answer than it might seem. For one thing, to adequately determine the influence of stare decisis on a justice's decision-making process, we need to develop a research design that is falsifiable. That is to say, we need to be able to generate predictions about how the law, through precedent and stare decisis, causes a justice to behave a certain way. And through empirical tests of these predictions, we need to find a way to distinguish between the theories. But sometimes the theories make the same predictions, so only some predictions inform which theory is accurate. I know that all sounds very technical and confusing, so let's look at it in a more concrete way. Scholars that ascribe to the legal model of judicial decision making predict that justices rely on the law in the choices that they make. Thus, if a justice is motivated by legal considerations and the relevant precedent in a case supports the lower court's decision, then we should expect that the justice affirm the lower court's decision if precedent tells them to do so. Conversely, if a lower court's decision conflicts with Supreme Court precedent, a legally motivated justice should reverse the lower court's decision. Scholars that adhere to the attitudinal model also make predictions about justices' voting behavior. Specifically, they predict that a justice will vote to affirm a lower court's decision if that decision is closer to the justice's own ideal point. Conversely, the attitudinal model predicts that a justice will vote to reverse the lower court's decision if doing so will move the legal policy closer to his or her ideal point. Thus, both theories of judicial behavior make predictions about the justice's voting behavior. But disentangling the causal effects is extraordinarily difficult. For example, attitudinalists might predict a justice will affirm based on ideology, and the legal theorists might predict that a justice will affirm, though they base their prediction on established precedent. The outcome of the prediction is observationally equivalent, which is to say that we simply do not know if the justice voted the way that he or she did because he or she was motivated by her policy goals, or whether she voted the way that she did because she was constrained by legal precedent to do so. It is only when a justice behaves contrary to expectation that we are able to assess causation. So, for example, let's say that based on the ideological compatibility between a justice and the lower court's decision, we would expect that the justice wants to reverse. That is, ideologically, for simplicity's sake, let's say that we have a conservative Supreme Court justice and the case came out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and is a liberal decision. So from an ideological policy perspective, we suspect that that conservative justice would like to reverse the ruling of the Ninth Circuit Court. That's motivated by policy. So if a justice is motivated by policy preferences, then we're going to predict that justice wants to reverse the lower court's decision. But let's also say that in this case, established precedent supports the lower court's decision. If a justice is constrained by stare decisis, then that justice should vote to affirm. Now we have competing predictions, and the outcome of the vote tells us something about the motivation of the justice, because we have the attitudes predicting one thing and the legal model or precedent predicting another. And so here we can see which way the justice votes. Do they vote to affirm because that is what the precedent commands or suggests that the justice ought to do, or does the justice follow his or her own ideology and vote to reverse because that is what they prefer to do from a policy standpoint? To get around this observational equivalence, Jessica and Harold Spaeth implemented an innovative research design to study the voting behavior of the justices to tease out whether votes are driven primarily by ideological policy preferences or primarily by the principle of stare decisis. In particular, they examine how justices who dissented from important precedent-establishing cases voted in the future when faced with related cases. They argue that when a justice dissents in a case, it is a true reflection of that justice's preferences and is an explicit, tangible way to see when a justice disapproved of the precedent being set in an original case. So this is a pioneering case where precedent isn't controlling. The justices are stepping into a new legal arena. So Segal and Spaeth then looked into all subsequent progeny cases, which are cases that follow the original case, that are factually similar and rely on the original precedent in the court's majority opinion. If stare decisis is influential, the argument goes, then the justice who originally dissented ought to switch his vote to support that precedent in the future. As Segal and Spaeth cogently argue, influence requires people to do what they otherwise would not. If their original preferences conflict with the precedent, and they subsequently support the precedent, we can make a strong presumption that the established precedent influenced their votes. A couple of examples serve to clarify. In the 1965 case of Griswold versus Connecticut, Justice Stewart rejected the creation of a right to privacy and its application to married individuals. But just 7 years later, in the progeny case of Eisenstadt versus Baird, Stewart accepted Griswold's right to privacy and even extended it further to apply to non-married individuals. As another example, former Chief Justice Rehnquist dissented in the jury exclusion cases of Batson versus Kentucky in 1986 and Edmondson versus Leesville Concrete Company in 1991. But by the 1992 case of Georgia versus McCollum, Rehnquist switched his vote to uphold the precedent that he disagreed with. At the time, he wrote a concurring opinion stating, and I quote, "I was in dissent in Edmondson and continue to believe the case to have been wrongly decided. But so long as it remains the law, I believe it controls the disposition of this case, and I therefore join the opinion of the court." While these brief examples suggest that vote switching does indeed occur once a precedent has been established, is this indicative of a systematic and substantively meaningful influence of stare decisis? To determine the effect of stare decisis on justices' voting behavior in progeny cases, Segal and Spaeth classify votes as preferential, which means that if a justice dissented in the original precedent-setting case, he or she continues to reject that precedent in future cases. That is, they are relying on their ideological preferences, or as precedential, which means that if a justice dissented in the original case, she switches her vote to uphold that precedent in a future factually related case. The scholars gathered data from almost 2,500 unique votes, including all landmark cases and a stratified random sample of minor or ordinary precedent-setting cases. Of these votes, 88% are classified as preferential, and a mere 12% are classified as precedential. Moreover, in landmark or important cases, justices very rarely are likely to display precedential behavior. Indeed, when the justices base decisions on precedent rather than on their policy preferences, the vote switch tends not to carry a lot of weight since the case is likely to be of lesser political importance. In sum, the Segal and Spaeth study provides evidence that in terms of voting behavior, preferences swamp precedent. The influence of stare decisis on decision-making, then, is apparently quite minimal. The initial study by Segal and Spaeth offers what seems to be solid evidence in support of the attitudinal model, and a fairly strong refute to the legal model of judicial decision-making. However, the study is not without its limitations. For one thing, the Segal and Spaeth approach looks only at voting behavior of the justices. While this is, of course, valuable, it misses a lot of nuance of the court's treatment of precedent. In the court's majority opinion, justices have the ability to modify precedents to make them weaker or stronger. It isn't simply a binary choice of whether to support or reject a precedent. In general, the court can positively or negatively interpret its previous precedents. Positive interpretation of precedent involves the court's explicit reliance on the case for at least part of its justification for the outcome in the present case. The court can simply affirm the precedent, or it can expand its scope, thereby broadening the strength and reach of the original precedent. The court can also negatively interpret precedent by restricting its scope or by calling into question its authority in the present case. The court has a lot of options for negatively interpreting precedent. It can choose to distinguish the present case from the original precedent-setting one, limiting the precedent's applicability. It might also choose to read and interpret the precedent more narrowly, limiting its effectiveness. Finally, the court has the option of overturning precedent altogether. In their 2006 book, Tom Hansford and Jim Spriggs used the strategic model of judicial decision-making to employ a research design that tries to move beyond a simple binary vote choice to affirm or reverse to actually examine when and how the court, as an aggregate collegial body, interprets precedent in its majority opinions. They argue that there are two primary reasons that the justices choose to interpret precedent. First, the justices interpret precedent either positively or negatively to move the precedent closer to the court's aggregate policy preferences. So again, the distinction, or one of the big distinctions between the Hansford and Spriggs study and the previous Segal and Spaeth study is that Segal and Spaeth were looking at individual level, individual justice voting behavior. Hansford and Spriggs are looking at how the court as a collegial unit, as one observation, the court is acting as one, how the court treats precedent in the majority opinion. And so they're arguing that the court interprets precedent because they want to pull the legal rule closer to the views of the majority of the court, not of individual justices, but of the court as a whole. And second, Hansford and Spriggs argue that justices use precedent to legitimize their current policy choices. Remember that a substantial part of the court's authority comes from the perception that it has the right to determine what law is. Adherence to stare decisis enhances the court's legitimacy and motivates the court to root its decisions in established precedent. As such, the authors identified two key components to a precedent that determine if, when, and how the court as a whole will interpret precedent in its opinion. The first consideration is the court's policy agreement with the relevant precedent, and the second consideration is the legal vitality of the precedent. Like Segal and Spaeth before them, Hansford and Spriggs acknowledge that policy preferences largely motivate judicial behavior, and that the justices would like to shape legal policy in a way that leads to outcomes that are consistent with our preferences. This leads them to hypothesize that the smaller the ideological distance between a precedent and the court, the more likely the court is to interpret precedent positively. Conversely, as ideological distance grows, the court becomes increasingly more likely to negatively interpret a precedent. The predictions from policy agreement are what we would expect and really aren't particularly groundbreaking or exciting. The second component, on the other hand, introduces a new level of interest. Hansford and Spriggs assert that the likelihood that the court cites a precedent and the likelihood that the precedent is interpreted positively or negatively depends in part on the vitality of the precedent. The vitality of a precedent is quite simply how authoritative the precedent is. In other words, precedents vary in their legal vitality, as some precedents carry greater legal weight and have a bigger bite, so to speak. So for legitimacy reasons, the authors argue that the court is more likely to use legally vital precedents to justify its opinion in a present conflict. The vitality of a precedent is dynamic, meaning that it can change over time as the court interprets or reinterprets the original case. The authors then develop a measure of legal vitality based on the court's past interpretation of the precedent. Adding another layer of complexity and interest, Hansford and Spriggs contend that legal vitality can either attenuate or amplify the effect of the court's policy agreement with precedent. Their theory predicts that the probability of positive interpretation goes down as ideological distance increases. But in cases where the precedent has high legal vitality, which means it has a positive interpretation history, the impact of policy agreement will be much less. In short, the court will be more likely to interpret a legally vital case positively, even when ideological distance increases. So legal vitality attenuates or lessens the effect of ideological distance. On the other hand, the probability of negative interpretation increases as ideological distance grows. This intuitively makes sense, right? Because the court wants to limit the scope of precedent that it disagrees with, it has an incentive to distinguish, limit, or overturn such precedents. and legal vitality, the authors hypothesize, will increase this likelihood. Again, this intuitively makes sense because the court will get a greater return for its investment if it's able to alter the scope of a precedent to bring it more in line with its current ideological policy preferences. And if the precedent is legally vital and carries more weight, the impact of this change will be of greater magnitude. At the most basic level, Hansford and Spriggs seek to determine if the law matters in the interpretation of precedent, not just in voting behavior. And the short answer to that question is yes. The empirical evidence is consistent with their theory. That is to say, the probability of positive interpretation goes down with ideological distance, but it goes down less for precedents with a positive history. And the probability of negative interpretation goes up as ideological distance increases, and it goes up even more for precedents that are highly vital. We'll briefly run through some of their specific findings now, but one thing that I want you to keep in mind at this point is that the likelihood of any one precedent being interpreted either positively or negatively in a given year is really low, simply because there is limited space on the court's agenda. So some precedents are never relevant, and because the court has so many precedents from which to choose, many cases are never cited again. But regardless of the small likelihood that the court will choose to interpret a precedent, the interaction between policy agreement and vitality explains the variation in the occurrence and treatment of precedent. In cases where there is low policy agreement between the median member of the current court and the precedent, where the precedent has low vitality and therefore less legal weight, there is only a 6% chance that the court will interpret that precedent positively in the current case. On the other hand, if the precedent has high vitality, therefore it matters more in the legal sense, even if the court doesn't ideologically agree with the precedent, the chance of positive interpretation jumps up to 10%. Interestingly, a precedent has the same chance of positive interpretation if there's high ideological agreement but low vitality. This result shows that the court is more likely to positively interpret precedent if it is ideologically more proximate to the precedent. And finally, when the court is already predisposed to positively agree with precedent, vitality only has a minor impact, increasing the chance of positive interpretation from 10 to 11%. Let's briefly review what we've learned today. The doctrine of stare decisis is perhaps the most recognizable feature of the American judicial system. The Supreme Court began to cite its own precedents as legal authority in the early 19th century, and the informal rule of stare decisis was well established by the mid to late 19th century. Reliance on stare decisis serves to legitimize the court's decisions and plays a major role in the justification of its opinions. Yet assessing the influence of stare decisis in judicial behavior has been a challenge, and early evidence suggested that, at least in terms of voting behavior, policy preferences reigned supreme, and concern for precedent took a backseat. However, more recent studies provide evidence beyond voting behavior of individual members of the court to show that the law does indeed matter. Specifically, the legal vitality of a precedent can mitigate the court's ideological policy goals. In the end, then, the empirical results provide further support for the strategic model of judicial decision-making, as the justices seem to be driven primarily by policy concerns, but are substantially influenced by the politics of precedent. And that's where I will leave the topic for today, so make sure that you understand the brief history of the use of stare decisis in American jurisprudence. Think about how precedent influences both voting behavior and how precedent is interpreted in Supreme Court decisions when there is varying degrees of ideological opposition from the majority of the court. If you can do those things, you're in great shape.